Bethesda's back at it again, Fallout 4 being an interesting situation, really. After phoning home to Doom's id Software, it comes with drastically improved FPS mechanics, but it forgoes everything else to get there. That, and it loses all sense of character and story on the way, as the characters are pretty much the personality of drywall. Starting out, first thing you'll notice, Fallout 4 looks alright. It's not particularly good looking, but stock it looks kinda lackluster, but fortunately there are plenty of mods to save you here. After a lot of time spent on mods, Fallout 4 actually has decent colors, high resolution textures, things look like they should be there. However, even stock Fallout is actually kind of bright and inviting. This conflicts with the dark and dead world theme caused by the story and the attempt at an atmosphere in this regard. Nothing individually really sticks out of place, but the entire package kinda does. The world seems untouched by a nuclear detonation that at the start of the game, you could physically see and hear the detonation. And from that we could determine that the nuclear blast was really not that far away, maybe some miles. A lot of buildings and structures are more weathered looking by time than damaged by nuclear detonation. Sound in Fallout 4 is actually kind of a bad spot for it. The ambient soundtrack is actually quite good, and so is most of the real-life music over the radio. However, it doesn't really fit the theme of a dead world of Fallout overall. Fallout 1 and 2 had far more of a drab and destroyed world atmosphere, where Fallout 4 is almost inviting and friendly with its tone. Continuity-wise, it makes very little sense why somebody would be walking around in a dangerous world with a radio strapped on their arm blasting music pretty loudly. Most of the sound effects in Fallout 4 are pretty stock. Guns sound like movie props more than real-life guns, but the powered armor sounds really cool, thwomp, thwomp. You can almost hear the actuators in the exoskeleton as you run around, but there's like some weird sound effect where it's like whoosh as you start sprinting. Why would it make that sound? You're not really going that fast. But overall, the sound mixing is pretty good as well. I had a very few cases where I heard something that sounded low quality or out of place. It was pretty rare. Character voices have a few changes. For one, the main character is actually voiced now with a relatively decent voice actor. However, they had to significantly cut back the amount of interactions down to 4.
About my daughter.
Why did your daughter really leave? Your wife says she left on her own, but you said it was kidnappers.
I know it was kidnappers. Kasumi is a smart girl, but she doesn't know how horrible people can be. Not like me and Ray. Why would she just leave her family with no explanation? Someone tricked her. Got her to leave the safety of home. Every minute we aren't looking for my daughter, her life is in jeopardy.
I'm assuming this is to save cost on this said voice actor, and a lot of the time, the words don't even match the text on the screen either. So a lot of the time you're just being a jackass, and you didn't even mean to.
Stop! Please! I beg you!
Now to gameplay. This is a bit of a topic of debate for a lot of people. Combat in the first-person shooter Fallouts specifically is much better than either the other two. Controls are pretty tight, responsive. Hit detection is mostly accurate, with bullets only sometimes flying through enemies without registering. This overall creates a much more smoother gameplay experience than Fallout 3 and New Vegas. However, they basically abandoned ship on all the RPG elements completely to get there. Basically, all progression gives you now is a % damage increase. More on that later. They also removed random critical hits for some reason. This actually removed, personally, my build type. I always do crit builds in RPGs. Basically now it's like a power attack that you save up over time by using VATS, and it's a guaranteed hit, even if the chance it hits 1%, and it does extreme damage. Overall, that doesn't really make sense, because sometimes you can just like shoot through walls and other things that, again, don't really make sense. But what makes the least amount of sense in this regard is why would you use VATS after you spent so much time making the first-person shooter gameplay so much better? It doesn't really line up. Most of the time, you'll be fighting raiders. Sometimes they're super mutants, but for the most part, it's raiders. I recommend you install mods that add more wildlife and more variety to factions, but in my experience, some of those cause crashes because people can't make uncorrupted textures, so your mileage may vary in that regard. Level design is actually kind of surprisingly a step in the right direction in most cases. There's a lot less corridors of one path like Skyrim, but not really the urban sprawl lineup of Morrowind and Oblivion. But there's also no stupid walls of rubble that mean you can only go one way through Washington, D.C. of Fallout 3, or really 2 overall layouts of metros for that matter in the same game. However, there's not a ton of options for layouts in general for interiors, but there is a lot more than Fallout 3, so they have made improvements here. Fallout 4 also has a huge map, and a huge amount of interiors to explore as well. It's almost too much. A lot of the times when I play, I only explore about the top half of the map before I lose interest. Which is really unfortunate, because I bet there's a ton of things in the southern region that just go totally missed by most people. I have full done the whole map just once when I was really bored, I guess. I don't know. But I'd imagine that since there's so much, it's overwhelming, and a lot of people don't even see the stuff at the bottom of the map most of the time. I didn't even know Quincy was there until my 3rd playthrough. Now, one point of contention, loot is completely random with a very, very few specific set of parameters that determine what will be in a box. Like, for example, boxes will be assigned a loot table, almost like World of Warcraft, where it'll be, this is an ammo box, this is a medical box, but what actually shows up in those boxes can be almost totally random, and you may find some weird continuity issues in this regard. Like, for example, you'll find boxes at end bosses that will have either amazing items or absolute garbage pipe weapons or something, seeing as it's almost completely random. This makes sure you'll have a somewhat different experience each time you play the game, but it also means that a lot of the time you will waste your time. You'll also be able to find good ammo and weapons in exterior portions of buildings, or even just like on the side of the road. This doesn't make any sense because there's no way those things would still be there many years later, and if somebody put it there, they would never do that, because why would you put something valuable or necessary in a very unsafe location like right inside the door? This is where the benefit of hand-placed loot comes into a factor, because you can actually factor this into your level design as well and make it all make sense. Now, that takes a lot more time and a lot more effort, so I'd imagine that's probably why they went the way they did. Interestingly enough, there really isn't that many weapons or armors to choose from in Fallout 4. It's far less than New Vegas, for example. A lot of the time you or the NPC will be using like pipe weapons, followed by 3 different maybe rifles or handguns with a handful of variants based off of the base type unit that are really not that much different. Some of these variants are fully automatic or semi-automatic versions of the same gun. Oh, and why? Does the damage go down with an automatic weapon? This makes no sense. And on top of that, you got uniques in Fallout 4, but they're basically just slight damage upgrades over the stock gun. Most of them aren't really a whole lot different, or they're just like Bane of something, like does more damage against Mirelurks. New Vegas and Fallout 4, for that regard, had uniques that were totally different. They maintained the stock like look and maybe the stock function, but a lot of the things were completely changed of how they actually work. Now, New Vegas also had switchable ammo types, hollow points, armor piercing. This was great because it made like lower caliber guns worth using, especially against the right enemies. Like if you used hollow points against ghouls, it would absolutely wreck them. Fallout 4 doesn't have this, and it really should. This is a big gap. They did change power armor, however, and I think it's for the better. They now use a resource to run fusion cores, and they provide way more protection than they ever did before. It makes extremely durable and resistant to radiation. However, they have like max durability and have to be repaired over time. Once they get too damaged, they basically just fall off and don't do anything anymore. They also added new mechanics like base building and more onto the crafting mechanics of the old. For base building, basically you can build an entire settlement from scratch, almost. There's all sorts of options for buildings, defense, each settlement requiring food, water, defense, and housing. But in the end, it has almost no reason to exist. They serve little to no purpose whatsoever. Base building is almost entirely cosmetic and has pretty much no impact on the actual gameplay. They really could have flushed this out by adding some sort of mechanics to it, like, I don't know, patrol radiuses around settlements, for example, or zone control, honestly, similar to Grand Theft Auto San Andreas' gang war land control. That would have been cool. Maybe in these regions people scavenge, or there's less hostile wildlife or other humans for that matter. At least do something, seeing as it has no reason to exist outside of the sake of cosmetic. Now, crafting is pretty unique and cool. Changing receivers on stuff to make guns automatic or semi-automatic, or adding higher damage, adding scopes to guns or sights. But in the end, it actually ends up being pretty shallow once you start looking at it. It's pretty much a linear progression, with each one being a slight improvement over the last one. I think this is designed to replace skills from Fallout New Vegas and Fallout 3. Each point was a slight improvement to damage and accuracy, and basically that's what this does. It's the same thing. Hacking and lockpicking are still in the game, similar to the previous titles. Basically, if you're not familiar, hacking puts out a garbled mess on your screen, and you pick out words and other things in the display, and when you pick out the words, it'll tell you how many letters you have in the correct spot. So basically, by process of elimination, you determine what the correct word is. I use a mod that just shows you what the correct word is because I hate this system. It's stupid. Lockpicking is a bobby pin and a screwdriver. You basically move the bobby pin left or right, spinning it on the cylinder, and then you use a screwdriver to spin the whole cylinder and unlock the door or whatever. Followers make a return. No surprise there, and a lot of them actually have pretty decent overall backstories and character development. About half of the total followers are actually good though, and that leaves you to about 6 to choose from, which isn't bad. That's about in line with the previous titles. Onto another example of contention. Radiation, the silent killer. Now in Fallout 1 and 2, you have to be really careful, as you can accumulate a lethal dose and not even know. In these original 2 titles, it was only measured by a device you had to carry, and you basically had to use it. If you accumulated too much radiation, you could die out of nowhere. This is extremely easy to do, and I can't imagine a ton of people didn't end up breaking their saves in this way. This is why if you play the original Fallout games, you really gotta make multiple saves and keep them multiple in-game days apart so you don't put yourself in a corner. In Fallout 3 and New Vegas, it was a debuff that would inevitably kill you, but up until a point it was just a stat debuff. But it was metered in real time, unlike the classic games. In Fallout 4, it simply reduces your maximum health and is even more metered as it shows as a meter on your health bar. The problem with metering and reducing the overall threatening nature of radiation is basically it becomes a non-issue. In real life, you almost always would figure it out too late. Meanwhile, in the newer games, you could see it measured per second. It's no creeping death, no silent killer. Fallout 4 has far less quests and even less meaningful ones than New Vegas. A lot of the quests in Fallout 4 are extremely simple. Go here, kill this guy, grab this thing, bring it back, thanks bub. Meanwhile, New Vegas has a lot of times where quest lines would have actual backstory, branching decisions, fulfilling choices. Even Fallout 3 did a pretty good job of actually telling a story and letting you learn more about what happened or why people made their decisions in this regard. There was also a lot more of them in Fallout New Vegas than Fallout 4 even could dream of. Meanwhile, most of the quests in Fallout 4 are just Preston Gravy telling you, hey, go kill 10 of this thing for me. The people need help, go talk to them. And a lot of the times, if you've done a lot of them, they'll just loop, and it'll have you go do the same thing. It's like there's only 5 or 6 of him to choose for, and sometimes it'll just repeat. Previously, New Vegas and Fallout 3 had 4 DLCs each. Fallout 4 has 2. 2 main ones and a bunch of small, insignificant ones nobody really cares about. This seems like a bit of a cop-out, seeing as they were selling a Season's Pass at launch, and previously, I would have felt a bit cheated if I had bought the Season's Pass, seeing as the previous titles had a precedent of 4 major DLC packs, and maybe a few small handful ones here and there. Nuka World is pretty take it or leave it, but it's basically more of Fallout 4, not really a whole lot different. It's pretty much just the same thing. Meanwhile, Fahaba is a big change. Fahaba is absolutely superb. It feels like a totally different development team made it. The characters are well written. The level design makes sense with the actual geographical design of the island and the region. People are in places that make sense. Fishermen are on boats. Super mutants probably can't swim, so they took over a huge cluster of buildings. Passwords and keys are hand placed inside of locations that make sense instead of just laying on a table somewhere. The story of the island is really good too. There's a lot of good progression of characters and world building. This, coupled with the great voice acting of the main characters, goes a long way. Dima is probably the best written and voiced character Bethesda has ever put into one of their games before.
When I first climbed this mountain above the fog, I thought to myself, now here is a metaphor worth taking in. You've entered a place of clarity, understanding, peace. While you're here in Acadia, Synthkind welcomes you as long as you welcome us.
I came here looking for Kasumi Nakano.
Really? I'm impressed. Few would brave the kind of journey you've had for the sake of someone else.
His story has great continuity. It's grounded. His decisions make sense. He did a lot of terrible things with good intentions, even if those things were murder one to save thousands. He even buried the past from himself because he couldn't live with it. He erased these memories and stored them somewhere. But in the end, he comes to terms with his actions and accepts whatever judgment is brought upon him. This is a prime example of what Fallout 4 could have been. Great characters, level design, atmosphere, monsters.
No memories before
More like 4 voice
a
actors.
single day, and then
I swear Far Harbor was made by somebody else. It's not even buggy. It just works.
to us as the truth.
And to touch it back on the Season's Pass, I wouldn't even be mad if I bought it. Far Harbor is worth it. It's worth the whole purchase price.
Reality.
Now, a huge issue in this game, perks. Back to our normal tone. Why? They scaled it back, made it extremely streamlined. Why Part 2? Basically, it's a mixture of bad design and Skyrim. You need the corresponding special stat to get the perks below it, ranging from 1 to 10 in the stat, and if you don't have enough, you can spend a perk point to raise the stat. This also sucks when you keep in mind they reduced the amount of starting stats you get compared to every other Fallout game. But some of these don't even make sense. 6 charisma and a perk to create a supply line between your settlements? Just that way they could share inventories? Or at the very least give each other food and water? And then 2 perks of the same one to build shops inside your settlement? Literally the only reason to have the settlements at all is the shops. They're not even that great, but it's pretty much the only reason to do it. Most perks in the game are replacements for skills, like percent damage adders or being able to lockpick or hack higher difficulty terminals. This also removes the skill gear that gave skill boosts to unlock stuff. This also makes most bobbleheads absolute garbage. They had to change it. Instead of giving you 10 to stat, they had to come up with something else, and a lot of them are pretty bad. Game engine overall and performance of the game engine is a mixed bag. In my experience, most areas will run at 60 frames per second, with basically all indoor areas running at that speed, but in the Boston area, it slows down for pretty much everyone. Even the most banging computer rigs will struggle here, and it's not just the consoles, lol. One thing that's interesting is, since Fallout 4 runs on DirectX 11, a mod maker, actually developed what's called a wrapper to translate DirectX 11 instructions into Vulkan ones instead. This can actually provide a pretty tangible performance uplift for a lot of people, seeing as Vulkan has much shorter draw calls than DX11 ever did. And this makes the response time of the graphics card to the driver much faster and reduces dips that can happen. You won't get the spikes down every now and then. And for AMD graphics cards users specifically, you'll absolutely see a huge gain of improvement. Seeing as DirectX 11 drivers from AMD are hot garbage, but the DirectX 12 and Vulkan drivers are considerably better and more efficient in their draw times. Now back to the game engine, the creation engine, the one that Fallout 4 runs on. I swear this thing has zero error handling or error logging. Plenty of times you will crash after modding it till it breaks, because that's the only way that's really willing to play it. But what causes your crash? Who knows? Doesn't tell you anywhere. This is made even worse by the fact that these crashes will come at random and it just desktop. No error logging, no error prompt, nothing. It's working and it's gone. There's a neat mod called Buff Out that actually adds some error logging, but this is really only logs for startup. I never had an actual error log work for a random crash while playing. This was only great for when I was trying to get the wrapper for Vulkan to work earlier. It never worked for me this time, but I did use it before and it was just fine. Not sure what the issue was, but I just kind of gave up on it and I got tired of messing with it. But I do remember it being an actual, tangible improvement. Either way, I could actually read the error on the crash and see even which memory cell was the access violation in, but I'm not a programmer, I don't know what the hell this means. So your mileage may vary with the buff out, but it again doesn't help with the random crashes. Honestly, I think this very well may be a big part as to why Bethesda games are so buggy at launch. Why would they not include to the end user error handling and readouts if they existed? Are their testers basically on a shoestring budget with pretty much no supporting tools and they don't even know what's causing their crash or how to reproduce it? This would make sense because Bethesda has a reputation, this game's not exempt from this, of releasing buggy, broken games. Who knows, honestly. Mods. You just knew it was coming, you just love to see it. No workshop support. Are you serious? Why would you do... I know why. Because they want to sell you mods. They want you to pay for them under what they call the Creation Club. Why in the hell would they do this? It makes zero sense. Even more considering Skyrim had workshop support and unpaid mods in this regard. A lot of people regarded this widely as a good thing and a selling point to Skyrim. However, here's a prime example of why paid mods are bad. I played a DLC-sized mod by a very famous modder that a lot of people on the Nexus widely regarded as essentially an industry professional. He also released 2 shorter levels when the mod tools first came out for Fallout 4, seeing as they didn't come out at launch, they took a little bit, which, cool, whatever. But these 2 were actually quite good. Anyways, I downloaded his DLC-sized mod, thinking for sure that if he had charged for it, most people would have paid for it. It was terrible. It was one of the most buggy, totally broken messes I'd ever seen, and that's putting it lightly. Triggers weren't working. It was super boring. Top to bottom, things were broken. I had to manually enable triggers in the console just to progress through. And yes, it is similar to some of the DLC packs where you can't leave until it's done. So you couldn't even back out. You could brick your save. If I had paid for this, I would have been furious. The idea of the Creation Club all along is to sell you these types of things with zero development cost on Bethesda's part. I don't like this. Yes, the Nexus Mods website kind of sucks. Yes, their Vortex tool is laggy, barely works. Yes, they cap your download speeds at unreasonably slow speeds unless you pay an exorbitantly high amount of money in perspective, but just stick with that. The Vortex Mod Manager off the Nexus, just go download that, get your mods from the Nexus, never fucking pay for a mod. Where's my son? Basically, in the story, you're the sole survivor of a vault full of cryopods. Your son was taken, you gotta find him. Conveniently, everybody else's cryopod failed but yours. That's nice. But while you're still frozen, people show up and kill your spouse, take your son, and leave. Now, the plot holes with this are these people shouldn't even know that you're there. They shouldn't even know of your existence. There's no reasoning here. In the first Fallout games, essentially, the Master was trying to make his own army of super mutants. So he was on the hunt for people that hadn't been exposed to radiation, or what they called prime normals. These are essentially people inside a vault. Why did they want them? Well, because they wanted to expose them to what was called the FEV, or Forced Evolutionary Virus. The cleaner your DNA was and untouched by radiation, the more likely you were to mutate cleaner and not die, essentially. A lot of the people with really radiation-exposed DNA would mutate a lot, and when they became super mutants, they would either die or be very stupid. Now, this makes even less sense when you think about it, because how would the Institute even know you're there? Why would the Institute want you? I guess they would, you could argue that it was pre-war information, or that they want you for the clean DNA, but then they don't want you or your spouse, they just want the kid. Why would they not want everybody? It's pretty likely that you guys would have just done what they said, because they could have just said, we're the government, and you probably would have listened. There's a few plot holes here, and there's even more later when you start to get more into the story, but I'm not getting into that. Oh look, a bunch of factions, the main ones being the Brotherhood, the Minutemen, and the Institute. The Institute is going around capturing people, replacing them with synthetic people they call synths, ones that they have full control over. The Minutemen are essentially trying to build a republic, like the New California Republic, and the Brotherhood is being Adeptus Mechanicus and doing Brotherhood things. They're just stealing technology, keeping it to themselves, doing their thing. But for some reason, the Brotherhood, halfway through the game, has a big steel blimp. Inside of this big steel blimp, there's vertebrates. They shouldn't have any of this. These guys are descendants of the West Coast chapters of the Brotherhood, who are descendants of the US Army who went AWOL. I'm pretty sure the only faction in canon lore that ever had vertebrates was some East Coast Enclave and West Coast Enclave. Basically, these guys are leftovers of the US government. There's pretty much no way the Brotherhood could have ever gotten these vertebrates or this big blimp, or built it for that matter. How does this thing even float? Wouldn't basically a single RPG-7 rocket knock that shit straight out of the sky? Where would they even have gotten this thing? You don't just trip over this. Either way, basically all the factions are working against each other for the same overall general purpose. They want to be the one who makes it. This makes even less sense when people just inherently trust you in general. The Minutemen basically beg you to help them and trust you with everything in a span of like 10 minutes. The Brotherhood needs help with something that they really should be able to handle on their own. A 10-minute escort quest later, and oh, you want to be a Brotherhood member? In Fallout 1, you had to go to the Glow. The fucking Glow. The world is dead and super hostile. Why would anyone trust you? Basically, you're the player of a video game, idiot. That's why.
Mainlanders ain't patrol.
Put the damn gun down. Are you lost? This is Far Harbor. We don't get many visitors around here.
We don't need no freeloaders or more help, Mainlander. So you can get back in your boat and leave.
They trust you, but you can't even betray them. Like, oh, this guy's for a story path you aren't even gonna do. But if you shoot him, he just kneels down for a sec, then stands back up, and as long as you don't do it again or kill any of his friends, he's friendly. Why would they do this? Unkillable NPCs is a stupid mechanic and bad design. The story ending in Fallout 4 is what I call the Endo-Vendotron. Basically, you just choose one of pretty much 4 identical endings, but they're different factions, and you win. Haha, they lose, got them. So essentially, you just pick whichever one you like the most. It's not like New Vegas, where you could pretty much force everyone to lose, and there isn't really any narrative like Fallout 3 sorta had. Basically, you just watch a big-ass explosion, probably, and then roll credits. It's not even like the other 2 games where Ron Perlman talks about your experiences and what you did to actually change the world for the better or the worse. He makes a super blanket statement about how stuff happened, and then cuts to black, and then just pushes you into keep playing mode, or essentially New Game Plus, but not starting over. Honestly, it's the perfect way of ending Fallout 4. A super shallow and totally pointless showcase ending to a super shallow and totally pointless story. Now, all things considered, is Fallout 4 a good or a bad game? Is it even a Fallout game? These are both honestly really tough calls. Bethesda really gave up on being an RPG pretty much entirely, all in favor of being a first-person shooter, which really isn't Fallout. With the extreme streamlining of a lot of player character development and basically removing everything, also not even considering any of the previous titles, not even their own Fallout 3, even a little bit, is Fallout 4 even a Fallout game? Nah, it's really not. I've played Fallout 4 plenty of times for a lot of hours, but honestly I think that's because there's just nothing else like it out there. I think this applies to a lot of Bethesda's games. Not because Fallout 4 is a good game, I might add. A lot of the short-sighted design decisions, basically no player character development, or even character development of everybody in general, and a ton of features that have pretty much no reason to exist at all. I guess you could consider buying it, but I definitely wouldn't pay full price. Maybe like $15 with Fahaba, of course. Oh, and if you do decide to get it, I wouldn't play it stock. I wouldn't recommend it at all. At the very least, install the unofficial patch. It fixes a bunch of bugs and like triggers that don't trigger. However, I can't in good faith recommend buying Fallout 4. It's got so many problems at its core design. It's just so half-baked. But at the same time, it's not a game that's really that bad to just vegetable on. Just waste hours wandering around. But if you're looking for story, engaging mechanics, rewarding decisions, or anything that's not just, I'm sitting on my couch, playing a game. Fine. Like the first two Fallout games had the exact opposite of, look elsewhere. If you're interested in this, then maybe pick it up on sale. Personally, I recommend you just play Fallout New Vegas. It's just a better game overall. It has worse combat. That is genuinely something that Bethesda really did make a big jump with. Their level design in Fallout 4 is much better than pretty much everything after Morrowind that they touched. But in the end of the day, it doesn't change the fact that Obsidian's way better at story building, world building, writing, dialogues, characters, character development, player character development. You name it. They're just better in every single way. The only thing Fallout 4 has over New Vegas is combat. The combat in New Vegas, even modded, still is worse. As always, thank you for watching the video. If you liked the video, do not like the video, do your thing. Still, learning on each video on how to do a better job. Changing the way that I do my structuring and writing a little bit here and there in each video, and I think it's making progress, but again, if you have feedback, leave a comment. I read all of them.